Hello, and thank you for joining us today for What You Need to Know About AACSB Virtual Accreditation Visits. It's my pleasure to introduce today's panel, Stephanie Bryant, Executive Vice President and Chief Accreditation Officer for AACSB International, and Suzanne Mintz, Assistant Vice President for Accreditation Strategy and Policy at AACSB. But before we get started, and before we turn the floor over to Stephanie and Suzanne, it's my pleasure to introduce Karen Beck-Dudley, AACSB's President and Chief Executive Officer, with a few opening remarks. Karen.
Thanks, Bill. Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be with you today. As you can see, I am Karen Beck-Dudley, the President and CEO of AACSB, and I've been in this position since the 1st of June. But before that, I was the dean of 3 different business schools and 3 different universities, as well as a longtime volunteer for AACSB, I think over 20 years. And most recently, I'm the immediate past chair of the board of directors, and I'm thrilled to be with you. To give you an idea of who's in the audience today, we have schools and teams who this year will have virtual accreditation visits for their continuing improvement review. And we also have some schools and teams who will be doing virtual visits for the initial accreditation. So welcome, everyone. Our objectives in today's webinar with Suzanne and Stephanie are to provide an overview of what schools and peer review teams can do to plan and execute a successful virtual visit, to discuss best practices that have been learned from the 15 schools that recently went through virtual accreditation visits, to address some of the common questions surrounding COVID-19's impact on accreditation, those usually around AOL, faculty sufficiency, and financial strategies. And toward the end, of course, of the webinar, there'll be ample opportunity for attendee Q&A. So with that, let me turn it over to the capable hands of Suzanne and Stephanie, and I'll turn it over to Suzanne, who will cover a few housekeeping items and get started. I'll leave you now. Thanks, Suzanne and Stephanie. Have a great webinar.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks so much, Karen, and welcome again to everyone. We're so glad to see so many of you here today. In terms of the format for today's session, we will begin with the first part of our webinar, where I will be facilitating a question and answer discussion with Stephanie Bryant to address common issues surrounding virtual visits. And for the second portion of the session, we will have plenty of time for attendee questions and answers. In terms of submitting your questions today, you will do so through the chat feature of Zoom. If you hover your mouse over the bottom portion of your screen, the Zoom toolbar will come up and you will see the icon for chat, and that will enable you to send in your questions via that feature. There are many of us here today, so we will do our best to address as many of the questions as we can. We may not get through all of them, but I can assure you that we will follow up personally and make sure that you have the support that you need. So without further ado, let's begin our session, and welcome, Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. Pleasure to be here, and I'm so glad to be with all of you. There's been a lot of demand for us to do this webinar, so I hope you feel this is time well spent today.
Great. Stephanie, let's start here. We could have never anticipated the tremendous impact that COVID-19 would have on the world, and AACSB has not been immune to this impact. Can you talk a little bit about the implications that COVID-19 has had on peer review team visits, especially those planned for the coming academic year?
Sure. Well, the obvious impact is that most of our accreditation visits next year are going to be handled virtually, which is what most of you are here to hear about. So you've been invited to this call because you're either a volunteer on a peer review team next year, or you're a host school who's having a visit. And so we want to give you the information that you need to make you feel comfortable. To give you some perspective, in a normal year, we have about 200 accreditation visits, and that includes both the CAR visits and the initial visits. This coming year, 2021, we have really about 250, and that's because When COVID hit us mid-March last year, we essentially had to put a halt to our accreditation visits that were scheduled at the end of last year. So all of those visits, with the exception of 15 that we did end up doing virtually, the rest were all moved to this year. So that causes us to have more visits this year. So I do want to pause and say thank you to all the volunteers who are doing double and triple duty to help us make that happen. So Suzanne, you asked me about what did this year's visits look like? And I'm going to take that in two parts. So what does it look like for a CAR visit, and what does it look like for an initial visit? So for a CAR visit, our plan A is that school visits are virtual. We've communicated that out to everyone who has a visit next year. Just plan on that visit being a virtual visit. Why did we do that? Well, we felt like that was the path of least disruption to the schools. With everything that you have going on and also having your accreditation visit this year, we know it introduces a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. And so we thought, you know what, let's go ahead and let them have their visit, but let's do it virtually. And let's make sure to keep the teams intact. Let's keep the date intact, because it takes 12 to 18 months to get those things all in place. So we thought that was a good thing. And from what we've heard from our schools, they're very grateful for that. It's also a chance to have peers visit you during a time of great disruption and help share what they have learned as well. And that's what the CIR visits are supposed to be about. As a bonus, if you're a school having a visit, you don't have to pay the travel cost, and that sometimes is very substantial, particularly if you're an international school. Very substantial cost for the team to travel. So just also, we think, a little bit of relief to you when finances are very tight. So that is plan A for the CAR visits. Plan B for those visits is, okay, what if we get a few months down the road and actually things look like an in-person visit could occur, or maybe a hybrid visit could occur where it's somewhat some people on the ground and some people remote. That would be okay. So if we get there, or if your school is in a part of the world, part of the country where you can have an in-person visit, that would be okay with us. If the team is willing and the school is willing, that would be okay. But we want you to sort of plan for the virtual, and then if the in-person can happen, that would be fine. Now, the plan for the initial schools is actually the opposite, where we're telling everyone for CAR visits, plan for virtual. We're telling the opposite for initial schools. We're saying plan for a face-to-face visit, but what we're doing on these schools, because remember, these schools are a standard by standard review, much more rigorous. We're looking at every single standard, and we have very high bar for initial schools. So we're saying to these schools, plan for face-to-face, but what we'd like you to do is don't anybody make any travel arrangements for 90 days up to the visit. Now, when you're 90 days from the visit, the peer review team and the school should have a conversation, and they should say, okay, what does it look like? Do we think we can have a face-to-face visit, or maybe a hybrid visit? And that might be the decision. And you would go ahead and plan for that. But they also might say, you know what, let's wait another month. So let's wait maybe 60 days. They might even say, let's wait till 30 days before, because none of us knows what this future is going to look like. It's hard for me to believe we're only 4.5 months into this pandemic now, and our worlds have been turned upside down. So what does it look like 4.5 months from now? We really don't know. Or next spring, what does it look like? We don't know. So plan A for initial schools is plan for face-to-face, do a touch point no earlier than 90 days before the visit, figure out if you think it's going to be a face-to-face visit, and if that cannot happen, we would entertain the idea of a virtual visit for initial. We have never done that to my knowledge, and so we worked very hard to come up with protocols where we felt like the quality could be maintained. To be able to get approved for a virtual visit as an initial, it has to go through multiple levels of approval. So the PRT chair and the team have to agree that it's a good idea. The mentor has to also approve. The staff liaison has to approve. And finally, I have to approve. My approval is contingent upon everybody else approving. And then what I would look at is, what kind of journey did the school have? Did the school have a relatively smooth journey? I mean, nobody's got a perfect journey. Was it relatively smooth? If so, then I'm likely to approve the initial visit occur virtually. However, if the school really struggled and maybe had to withdraw from the process, come back into the process, it was otherwise a bumpy journey, we want to set schools up for success. And so that's a case where I might say, you know what, we're going to wait on this and postpone this visit for maybe till next year, the following year, and do it as a face-to-face visit. Because we want people to be successful. We want to set people up for success. You've worked very hard to be able to have the right to have a visit, and we want to set you up for success. So that's pretty much what it looks like for CAR visits, as well as initial visits for next year.
Thank you, Stephanie, for such a thorough overview of what schools can expect. I'd like to share a key takeaway from that segment that Stephanie just covered. And really today, we're going to be sharing a lot of information with you. So after each question, we're going to be sharing key takeaways, things that we think are really important for you to walk away with today. So our first key takeaway relates to initial accreditation visits, particularly related to travel planning. We are requesting that schools and teams do not initiate any travel planning for initial visits at the very earliest until 90 days prior to the scheduled visit. And at that time, a decision will be made in conjunction with AACSB staff and the school. Stephanie, you shared that there are upwards, or the potential of upwards of 250 virtual accreditation visits. So that's extremely, a very, very high number. And I assume a lot of people here want to hear what are some general expectations in terms of the virtual visit. For example, what are some of the similarities as well as key differences between a virtual as well as an in-person visit? Can you share your insight on that?
Sure, and there's a couple of places in this presentation where we'll talk about this, but just to tee up the topic, the basic idea with a virtual visit is that everything that would have occurred in terms of meetings with various stakeholder groups, that everything that would have occurred in a face-to-face visit occur in a virtual visit. So typically you're talking to students, you're talking to faculty, different types of faculty, your support people, your advisory councils, all of that should be translated over into a virtual environment. And we believe that that is possible. And of course, our 15 schools that have done it have shown that that's possible. So that's really number one. Everyone you would have met with, including students. Students are very, very important in this process. As long as you can meet with all those same groups, that would be sort of our main criteria. And then secondly, all of the materials that you would have had access to prior to and during a visit have to be available virtually. So those are all kinds of things like faculty Vita and AOL reports and AOL data and all kinds of things that you normally want to see. You have to be able to have those available to you in a virtual visit. And we'll talk more about that, what that looks like in a little bit, but that's a requirement. So if I don't have access to faculty Vita, then I can't really judge faculty qualifications. So all of those have to be available. So that's the same for face-to-face and for virtual. One big thing that our schools that have gone through this have told us is whatever you do, don't try to replicate the time frame. So don't think that you're going to schedule an 8-hour day and a 4-hour follow-up day, or 2.5 days sitting in front of a computer. That's not going to happen. It's too hard on your body and it's too hard on your eyes, and it just doesn't work. So what we are being told by our people, which makes a perfect sense because we're all experiencing that right now too. I know I am. Shorter days for the visit, you might have to spread them out over 3 to 4 days so that you have shorter days and more frequent breaks. And we think that that will minimize your screen fatigue. And also we have some big challenges with time zones. So you might have people that are 12 hours apart. So how do you schedule meetings where you don't have people up in the middle of the night? So that you work on with your schedule. So really those are kind of your biggest differences, similarities and differences.
Great. So that takes us to our second key takeaway, and really emphasizing the point that just because the format is different for your accreditation visit, that the overall aim and objective remains the same, and that is for the peer review team to assess the school's quality. Let's move on into a topic that is going to be very, very critical for the success of any virtual visit, and that is the technology component. Stephanie, you mentioned that we've had about 15 schools that have already gone through over the past few months virtual visits. Can you share with us what platforms did they use, and also whose responsibility is it to coordinate the technology and the meetings?
So technology is really your big thing on this. So the technology needs to work, it needs to be done well, people need to be familiar with how to use it. So here are some guidelines for you. First of all, the host school who's having the visit selects the technology platform. So if the school is a Zoom school or a Google Meet school, or a Skype or a Teams, whatever platform the school uses, that is the platform that will be the peer review team virtual visit will occur on. And that's because the school has the responsibility for making sure that that platform is working, and they're going to have their IT people on great standby because, you know, technology happens. I don't care how much you practice. I don't care. You can do everything right, and still the technology might have glitches in it. So, so number one, select the technology platform that the school uses. Secondly, the school has the responsibility to set up the meetings. Now, the agenda will be mutually agreed upon, as it always is. And once you get that agenda, then the school has to go set up the virtual meeting rooms for the meetings to occur. And you'll do that in a way that makes sense according to the agenda. Some schools have also had the school set up a private room where the team can actually do their collaboration as well. And some teams have said, we really want to do that on our own. We don't want to be on the school's platform to do that. That's really, those kinds of details are up to the peer review team as to how you want to manage that. I would give you some of the best practice here. When you get your agenda set up, you need a column that has a link, a direct link to the room. So if it's a Zoom, as this is, for example, each meeting have a link to the room, even if it's the same room that's being used. And that way, because it's various people coming in and out of those meetings, it takes away the stress of where am I supposed to be? I know that's always my stress. Am I in the right place? Am I clicking the right link? So just go ahead and put it on the agenda so that it's very clear where everyone's supposed to be and when.
Stephanie, you alluded to this when you started to respond to this question, but I want to delve a little bit deeper. We know that probably more now than ever that technology is not always on our side. It's quite common, especially in this time. Interruptions happen, failures happen. We've heard of these things. We've experienced these things firsthand. Can you share some thoughts on how schools and teams can prepare for things such as this and undergo some contingency planning?
Sure. And by the way, I can see a lot of the questions popping up on the chat. So we will, many of your questions that I see popping up, we're going to answer, like this one right here. But we will take questions at the end. Go ahead and chat them in, type them in. That's perfectly fine. Don't see you because we will get to those. Okay, so what do you do here if your technology doesn't work? First of all, plan for it not to work. Plan for there to be some sort of interruption. And I would say you need a plan for both yourself personally. Like, what will you do if your laptop blows up on you? What will you do if your internet goes out? What will you do if the power goes out? This actually happened to me last week, 10 minutes before a session, an online session. And actually, Suzanne and I, who live close together, it went out in our entire neighborhood. So, okay, that's 10 minutes before our session. Those kinds of things do happen. So think about how you can protect yourself from those sorts of gremlins, right? That's kind of what I call them, technology gremlins. So you might, I would personally have a backup device available. If my primary device failed, I'd have a second laptop, computer, iPad, something that I could communicate on, and I'd be ready with that, so I wouldn't miss a beat. Also, if you've got auxiliary or portable internet, so maybe you can use your phone as a hotspot, or you've got a jetpack or something like that, just think about what could go wrong and how you can hedge against it. And then for the school, on the school side, what might happen with your platform? And what if people can't, for whatever reason, the platform goes down? I've also noticed that, and I bet you have too, it's through no fault of yours, but if there's very heavy traffic, for example, everybody's on Zoom in the world at the same time, you might have really bad connections, and it's no fault of the school, it's no fault of the team, it's the platform itself. So always have a plan B. So have an idea, and the team and the school have to kind of come up with what that plan B is. Maybe they'll meet an hour later, or whatever it happens to be. The other thing I would say is, and we always say this anyway, even if it's not a virtual meeting, everybody should have everybody's phone numbers. So have a plan for, okay, we're going to call the IT person, or we're going to call person X, and we will then regroup on what we're going to do next. So if you plan for the worst case scenario, then you're ready if it happens. If it doesn't happen, that's great. So I think it's, test, and have a plan B.
Well, those were our next two key takeaways. And as Stephanie said, don't just test internally, test externally with your external groups as well. They may not be familiar with the technology that your school uses, and we can't stress enough to always have a plan B. A lot of these video meeting platforms have a phone capability, associated phone numbers with them, so that could also be an option for plan B. In April, AACSB released some protocols for virtual visits, as we knew we were going to be going quite heavily down this path. The protocols that we released address some key requirements as well as some best practices. Stephanie, can you spend a little bit of time talking about what those baseline requirements are that AACSB expects?
Right, and so we have a website for this. We're not going to click through to it, but these slides will be available, as well as the recording of this session will be available pretty quickly after the session is over. And so you can go out and look at this resource on our website. It's divided into protocols, and then under it we have best practices. The protocols are the must-dos. They're the things that we have come up with to guard quality, to make sure we have quality. So we're very, very proud of the quality of our visits. So how can we make sure that we have quality? So the protocols at the top are the must-dos if you're having a virtual visit. Underneath it, you see a section called best practices. Those aren't must-dos, but those are things that schools have told us, and we have a slide a little bit later. We'll go through some of those with you, but best practices are, hey, this is what we found that works. So I'm going to back up to the must-dos, and I've touched on this a little bit, just go into a little bit greater detail on this and add a little bit more color to it. So the one thing I've already said is that you have to have all the same meetings that you would have had in a face-to-face meeting. Especially, I want to mention students. So if school is not in session for some reason, then, and I mean not in session, classes are not meeting, you've had a flare up, you've shut everything down, we are not going to approve that visit to go forward. But if you had to simply, you were open and then you moved everybody online, that would not be a deal breaker, because we'd still be able to talk to students online, just like we talk to your other people online. We do expect that you have a base room, and the base room, we use that terminology more with initial visits, but it sort of carries over, and you'll hear people use that, refer to the base room when they're talking about CAR visits as well. And the base room is really the place where we have all the auxiliary documents that a team might want to see. So for example, they want to see the AOL data that underlies your report, says here's our results. The team might say, well, we want to see that, particularly an initial team might want to see that. So the school needs to have that set up virtually, and they need to provide access to that virtually for the team. How that's done is up to the school. There's going to be a privacy component to that. And we know particularly in places where GDPR is very, very strong, there'll be privacy components to that. So the way I've seen that mostly done is the school sets up a private intranet site, for example, and gives access to the things that they want the peer review team to be able to have access to. And so a virtual base room can definitely be created and can preserve privacy and be privacy compliant as well. Now, here's something I haven't talked about that is on the must-do list, and that has to do with we have standards that talk about the facilities and making sure the facilities are in good repair and that they're current and that you are providing the right types of technology and so forth. So we have standards on that. Well, how do we get assurance over that in a virtual visit? Because we're not on the site. We can't walk around and see it. So here's what we've come up with that I think is a reasonable substitute for that, being on the ground and seeing it yourself. For CAR schools, we visited that school. We visited that school likely many times. We certainly visited them when they got initially accredited. So for CAR schools, we asked that the school provide the team with a video of what the facilities look like. Particularly, there's a lot of new building going on right now in business schools. So if you've built a new building, new facility since your last visit, you would want to have a video of that you could show to your peer review team. If you've got campus visit videos, that would be okay to show as long as it shows the business school, because that's what the accreditation is really around. So the accreditation is at the institution level, but we want to see what your business school and the facilities supporting your business program look like. Now, listen up for initial visits. It's different for initial visits. Remember, it's a standard by standard review, and an initial visit that is fully virtual, we would expect a walking tour. So a walking tour is where you're walking through the facilities and someone has a camera and they're actually showing, it's a live, here's where we are. And we're doing that, again, to comply with the standards, also to comply with our ISO certification. So our ISO certification requires us to look at your facilities. So this must be live. Unlike the CAR that can be pre-recorded, this must be a live on-site during the visit walking tour, and also designed so that the PRT can select the spaces they want to see. So if you're on this call and you are a member of an initial accreditation team, then you can say, hey, I read in your report that you have a new trading lab, or you have a new computer lab, or whatever it happens to be, whatever space you want to see. And the school then would walk with the camera and walk to where that is, realizing that there might be some space there, but that's also an opportunity for you to showcase as you're going the facilities. So that walking tour is intended to comply with AACSB standards and with ISO standards as well.
Great, and another resource I'll mention, it's not on this slide, but in addition to the virtual visit guidelines that Stephanie mentioned, which is under the accreditation menu on the AACSB website, there's also a sample virtual visit schedule that addresses, it looks very similar to the in-person with the exception of a lot shorter sessions, more breaks, and peer review teams and schools can get to that through the volunteers section underneath accreditation. So just wrapping up our key takeaway from this segment that I've heard Stephanie say actually more than once is really hitting on the fact that the virtual visit, while the format, the medium may be different, it is designed to mimic an in-person visit and include all of the typical elements and meetings that an in-person would. And that's also including the base room. And Stephanie, we have gotten a number of questions on the base room, which we're going to get to, rest assured, attendees here in a few minutes, but many questions on that. So let's shift gears a little bit. We know that uncertainty comes hand in hand with this situation that we are all in right now, and things are changing on a daily and sometimes even more frequent basis. So let's talk a little bit about this. For example, Stephanie, if we had an initial accreditation school in which the peer review team in school had agreed upon an in-person visit or maybe a hybrid visit, but then, shortly before the visit, things shut down or the school goes completely online. How would such a situation be handled?
Right. So I touched on this a little bit earlier. Conditions are changing so rapidly. And of course, you know that AACSB is located in Florida, and so changing very rapidly in Florida, but it's rapidly changing everywhere. So we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what it's going to look like 3 months from now. Hard to believe we're really only 4.5 months or so into this pandemic because it's turned our worlds upside down. So what's it going to look like 4.5 months from now? Very hard to say. Or if your visit is next spring, very hard to say. But to your question, Suzanne, if the school has has depended on and planned for an on-the-ground visit, either a hybrid or fully on-the-ground visit, and suddenly that's not possible, what we would look to is, are the students going to online classes, and therefore your faculty are online? Is everyone really sort of moving to online? Or are they suspending classes? If they're suspending classes, we will not have your visit at that time. We would postpone your visit because we're not going to be able to get students in the way, and faculty and other people. It will not be workable. So remember, that's a requirement. All the people have to be available. But let's say I expect that you're going to see some open, close situations all around the world, depending on how this virus shakes out. So we could be in an open, close situation where, okay, we thought we were going to be good. Suddenly we're not. We're going to move everything online. If everything moves online, we can still do the visit. We would do a virtual visit. However, we're not going to fly a team from all over the world to sit in a conference room at your school when everything is online. So we would do a virtual visit in that case, as long as we have access to all the players. So that's pretty much how we would determine.
So what I'm hearing, and we really want today's attendees to walk away understanding, is that if you are a CIR school, a CIR team, Plan A should be a virtual visit. That is something that we believe all CIR schools should plan for the reasons we just spoke of. Initial schools, again, will work with their liaison. They are not a given virtual visit. There are several approvals that Stephanie mentioned that have to occur, and if those cannot be achieved, then the visit would have to be postponed. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and address something that I know is on a lot of people's minds, and I personally have gotten this question quite a bit. We're hearing a lot about various measures, various actions that schools are having to take to address this unprecedented situation. Things such as faculty hiring freezes, suspending the GMAT requirement for graduate programs, maybe hitting the pause button on AOL. And there are many, many other examples of this. And people are concerned. People are worried about how these decisions may impact their overall accreditation. I'd like to get you, Stephanie, as Chief Accreditation Officer of AACSB, I'd like to get your direct perspective on this issue and this worry that's on a lot of people's minds.
Okay, so I actually think this is the $1 million question here. This is what you're most concerned about. The other stuff is logistics and how we handle the visits logistically. This is, okay, what happens if we don't align with the standards? So I sort of consider this the $1 million question. Here's where the thinking is currently. I think the main point is this a systematic problem or is this an unsystematic problem? So let's say, for example, the team is doing the visit and it's a virtual visit or it's a face-to-face visit. And oh my gosh, look, we were going to hire people and we couldn't. And our ratios now were out of alignment with standard 15. And so are we going to get a CAR2 because of that? Or we couldn't collect AOL data. We were planning to collect our data because remember, your self-study year was 1920. Okay, the self-study year, that's what we're looking at, and a whole bunch of you gather data or you analyze AOL data towards the end of the year. And that's when all this blew up. So I'm expecting there'll be a fair number of schools that couldn't close the loop or do their normal AOL activities at the end of their self-study year. So what's going to happen? So I know that there's fear about that because I've heard it, as Suzanne mentioned. It really comes down to, is this an event that's directly traceable to COVID-19? And otherwise, you would have been able to do that. If that's the case, I would call that an unsystematic issue. So an unsystematic issue is something that's directly traceable to COVID and something for which you can plan for and you can fix in the future. So you couldn't gather data, you couldn't do that, but you can do that in the future. So what we would expect you to do then is address it and talk about that and say, okay, here's the way we've been gathering data. You can see that we've gathered data and you can see that we have a really good, strong AOL process. We just had this thing happen to us. And so it just happened, but we have good results, and you can see the team is going to not hold that against you in that case. So if you're on this call as a team member, I want to convey to you that that's AACSB's position. This is a peer review, but our position is if it is non-systematic or unsystematic, that we understand that as long as it is recoverable and it is something that can be remedied as soon as we get over this virus, because we will get over this. Just the question of how long and what that looks like. You would want to show your peer review team the plan. They're going to want to see your plan for how you're going to overcome that. I would urge you to have a plan that is longer than a year. So in other words, you couldn't gather data. Don't assume that everything is going to be perfectly normal next year, because while you might have some pockets of normalcy, really it's probably going to take a couple of years for us to kind of get the ship righted. And we don't know. I'm not a doctor, don't pretend to be, but we don't know. So give your peer review team a plan for how you're going to deal with whatever that deficiency or whatever that standards non-alignment issue is. Now, I want to address the issue of financial exigency. I saw that come across the chat, so I'm just going to go there. So far, to my knowledge, there are a handful of schools that are in that situation where they are in real financial trouble, and there may be more. The reality is there may be more, particularly if this goes on for a really long, extended period of time. So if you're in that situation where you've declared financial exigency, or your financial situation is looking so rough and so untenable, you're not going to be able to hire faculty for years, that sort of thing, then we would be looking at your peer review team's going to say, okay, we think this is something that we need to spotlight as an area of continuous improvement review. And that's possible then that could be a CAR2. And that, again, CAR2s are meant to give you time to remedy situations as opposed to being, black mark. It's, hey, you need more time in this area. But it is a peer review team decision. But our general advice is it a systematic problem or an unsystematic problem? Unsystematic, have a plan, show your peer review team that you have a plan. And I think that's the general answer to this. And that covers no matter what the issue is, no matter whether it's financial, AOL, pass-fail grades, or whatever.
Right. And we've heard about a lot of different actions that are being taken, and just a few of them are on the slide. And again, the key takeaway here is that reasonable measures that the school has to take in order to respond, pass-fail, removing GRE GMAT requirements, faculty hiring freezes. We know that's going on pretty pervasively. Those are viewed as local decisions and will not be held against the school. On the flip side, the peer review team has to employ judgment to discern, is this a one-off COVID? I guess I would call it a COVID situation, or is this something that is ongoing, a systemic issue? And if it's the latter, then that could be problematic. But hopefully that this comment directly from Stephanie will take care of any concern or give you some relief. Before we open it up, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. I'd like to just touch on some additional best practices that we have learned through our 15 schools and teams that have recently been through virtual visits. So one of the big things that can get lost in a virtual visit is some of that social, the social element, dinners and so forth. But we've had a couple of schools that said, you know what, we're not going to let that stop us. They planned and had a virtual dinner where the team and school ate together at the same time, and they were able to build some of that camaraderie that you will get in an in-person visit. Just again, because it's a virtual visit doesn't mean you have to bypass a pre-visit. A lot of chairs in schools are conducting pre-visits, and I think that really helps enormously. Well, with any visit situation, but particularly with a virtual visit, because you're able to get up to speed, kind of get more familiar with the school in a way that you won't be able to be conducting the visit virtually. So plan to do that if at all possible. We've also heard from schools that what they did is designate a lead person that is responsible for kind of fielding the questions. They handle introductions, and they're aware of who is at each meeting, so they know when you can begin and who you might be waiting for. Another best practice, and Stephanie touched on this a little bit, I think it's pretty straightforward, but wherever possible, especially here when the stakes are high, try to use a wired connection instead of a Wi-Fi. As a matter of fact, Stephanie and I are doing that today because we found our Wi-Fi just was not reliable enough to do it in that way. Pretty much common sense, but it can be forgotten, and that is if you're not talking, mute. That will help to eliminate any ambient noise or background noise. Something that I heard and got directly from a peer review team member was this individual made it clear on their schedule that they were really on a peer review team visit. I think when you're at home, you're in your office at home, it can be easier to be distracted. Your colleagues realize you're not necessarily traveling, but treat it as if you were away so that you can really try to stay on task and on schedule. Some questions have come in about the agenda. We recommend that the meetings not be longer than 45 minutes in length. You can probably extend that to an hour, but not any greater than that. And ideally, you will schedule a few minutes break in between each session. Think about being at your computer for 3, 4, 5 hours straight. You need those breaks to stretch and to grab a cup of coffee or whatever it may be. And this last point I've highlighted or I've bolded because it's really critical no matter what format your visit is in, but probably more critical with a virtual visit. And that is keeping the lines of communication open, those communication channels before the visit, also during the visit. As Stephanie said, share cell phone numbers, emails. If you're dealing with an international school or team, WhatsApp, setting up groups in WhatsApp. I've seen that done, so you can quickly access people if an issue comes up. So now we'd like to spend about the next 15 or so minutes getting directly into your questions, and you have been very not bashful at all with submitting your questions. So I'm going to try to go in order. John, Dean Cootie, I did ask you a follow-up question you were asking if the school has a visit in November, when would the institution formally request a virtual visit? I think the answer is going to depend on, is this a CIR visit? If it's a CIR visit, the plan should be that the virtual visit happen in that fashion. If it's an initial accreditation visit, that would be by August 1st. If you have not spoken with the staff liaison assigned to that school, I'm sure you've heard from him or her, you can reach out to myself or Stephanie. We can get you some information on that. Stephanie, I'd like to address and then have you add on. There are a number of questions about the use of My Accreditation as a vehicle to share information. So I'll start, and then if you want to add any missing elements. For those schools and teams that have visits this year, CIR schools will be submitting your CIR report through My Accreditation. The exception would be any schools that had to get rescheduled from 1920. Because My Accreditation was not out at that time, we're not going to make you redo your report in that way. So you're going to submit your report in My Accreditation, and then subsequently, as someone mentioned on the chat, Gary McGill, yes, the team will also submit their peer review team report through My Accreditation. In terms of the virtual base room, well, technologically, you could utilize the addendum section of My Accreditation to submit data, files, for example, CVs. Probably that won't fly in all areas. For example, the EU has GDPR, and I think a lot of that data has to be stored on their own servers. And so in that case, we would recommend a platform in which documents can be shared confidentially. And also with My Accreditation, only certain individuals have access to My Accreditation. So if someone that was not one of the predefined roles needed to be able to access the base room, you would have to request that through AACSB. So Stephanie and I have spoken about this, and our guidance on this would be the base room be created outside of My Accreditation. Stephanie, anything to add?
No, I would agree with that. We didn't design My Accreditation to accommodate the base room. So there's a place that could serve that, but it's really not what it was designed for. So the base room really needs to be another virtual room that you give access to the team, and you have proper authentication and privacy controls necessary from the school's perspective. And otherwise, I just want to say My Accreditation is working great. So don't worry about that. It's going actually really, really well.
Let's stay on the topic of the virtual base room. Stephanie, would you recommend that the school give access to the base room prior to the visit, or just the days in which the visit is occurring?
No, for sure prior. Because if you're going to put CVs there, that sort of thing, the team is going to be looking at that ahead of time. So at the time, I would say at the time the report is turned in for a CAR, that's 60 days ahead of the visit, then I would have the virtual base room ready the day the CIR report is submitted.
All right, Stephanie, what is your advice on recommended length of meeting? I think this person sent the chat in before we covered that last slide, but can you just recap that?
Yeah, and I'll marry that with some comments that I just happened to see come in on the agenda that we've posted as sort of a guide agenda. So what people have told us that have gone through this is what we're basing this on, is really 45 minutes is kind of your sweet spot. So if you think we've been here 47 minutes, actually 49 minutes right now, and so, we're all starting to get a little bit stiff and that sort of thing. So really when you're sitting and you're looking at a computer and you're engaged in intense conversation, I would say no more than an hour. And then I think you need some time in between. So somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes in between is really ideal. Now the sample visit schedule that's online, everybody does the visit schedule different, and the school and the PRT, they come up with their own, what works for them based on who they want to see, where they want to spend their time. So I wouldn't worry about the schedule online not being exactly, what yours would be. So it's really just intended to kind of be a guide as to the types of people you might want to meet with and so forth. But the time in between meetings, I think, is really, really critical. And people can generally not go longer than 3 to 4 hours, again, depending on where in the world you are. So if you got people in 12-hour time zone differences, maybe you start at 8 in the morning, but remember that's 8 at night for the people in the 12-hour difference. And so how long can that go? So you have to consider that is very challenging, but it can be worked out. It's shorter times. We've heard typically 3 or 4 days of 3 hours at a time is sort of a norm, I think, that is emerging. Initial visits may be a day longer than that.
And Dean Kapaner, I'll address your question. During the 15 virtual visits that had to be conducted over the last few months, did the technology fail? To my knowledge, and I've talked to almost all of the schools and teams, no. They had some interruptions where people maybe got kicked out or sound was impacted. Usually what we recommend is get out of the platform, shut down your computer, restart, and go back in. And I think that worked well for individuals. So I was not made aware of any total failures, but what I would say is you would send a quick chat or text to the school and come up with ideally you've come up with your contingency plan before, but get on the phone, and that might be a solution in the meantime. A number of people have responded to a question about how the current rules are different than they were 5 years ago from Shantanu. Yeah, I agree. We probably can't get into the details of that today, but you may have been visited your last visit during 2003 standards. We have the 2013 standards now. All of our forms and templates are on our website. You should take a look at those. Another question was from Kathy about, Stephanie, I'm going to direct this to you. Their school has a visit next year. Can they, and I'm not sure, does next year mean 2021 or 21-22, but I think you can still address it. Can they go under the 2013 standards?
Under the 2013 standards?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm assuming we only invited to this webinar, this was by invitation only, people that have visits next year or who are on peer review teams next year. So I'm thinking their visit is 2021. So yes, 2021, which is the academic year that we've just now started as of July 1st approximately. These visits will all be under 2013 standards, with the exception of a very small group, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 schools that will pilot the 2020 standards. And we want to pilot them because we're also piloting volunteer training at the same time. Those schools will go up under the 2020 standards. That will be in the spring, and that's the way that will work. But everybody else will be under 2013.
And to follow up on that, what about schools with PRT visits in spring 22 or fall 21? When will the new standards be voted on? So I'll take that question. There was not a vote. There was a consent process, a written consent, and I guess this is an opportunity to plug that. Hopefully, if your dean has not yet consented, please ask her or him to do that. We expect an announcement to be forthcoming on July 28th as to whether or not those we received the quorum that we needed for that to happen. So assuming the answer to that is yes, then 2021 is a pilot year, 2020-21 is a pilot, and then starting next year, so Don, fall 21, spring 22 visits, those schools would have the option. So it would be more of an open process for that. Stephanie, can schools use repositories such as Dropbox for the base room?
Yes, that would be okay. Have you seen that, Suzanne? Has anybody used Dropbox to your knowledge?
Yes, I have seen that.
Yeah, we don't have a problem from our side. It's really on the school side, whether their security protocols allow them to use Dropbox. So, for example, at AACSB, we don't use Dropbox. AACSB as an organization. So it depends on whether the school allows that. But if the school allows it, there's no reason you couldn't use that.
Someone has asked about something called U-Visit Tours, and I'm not familiar with that. They're asking if they can use that. Are you familiar?
I think I know about what that is. So there are third parties that will come in and record your campus and do a really professional, very nice video that showcases your school. So no problem if you want to hire someone to come in and do that for the CAR visit. Even if it is, because the CAR visit is pre-recorded. It's pre-recorded and the video is made available. At the same time you make your report available, you make the video available. So everything has to be available at the time that you would, 60 days ahead of your CAR visit. Now for the initial visits, remember I talked about that being required to be a walking tour, but if you want to hire a professional videographer or whoever you want to hire to be the one holding the camera and doing that, no problem with that. Don't care who holds the camera.
I can take Jennifer's question. The protocols and best practices document relatively final. I think the operative word is relatively. Just like you got your schools, we are continuously improving and we're learning a lot. As every school that goes through a virtual visit, we learn something. So it will be updated as we get more insights on this. And so you just need to continue to check the website for updates. And then Sonia, Stephanie's addressed your question on the sample visit, and there were some questions about our sample. And again, that's just intended to be a guideline. Hassan has asked a question about the COVID-19 addendum. So I've brought this up on my other computer. That's why I'm looking over to the side. We do have some guidelines on our website, and this is also provided to the school in advance of their visit when you get an email confirmation with some further details. And it should address what's the impact of COVID-19 on your school to date, what actions have been taken by the school since this pandemic began, how is the school supporting students and faculty, and how has the situation impacted your school's ability to align with AACSB standards. So I'm actually really glad Hassan brought that up. We didn't touch on that. This is a requirement for all schools with visits this year to add as a separate addendum. Do not leave it within your report. Please create a separate addendum that addresses those questions. Okay.
While you're picking the next question, Suzanne, I just happened to see a question flash across that I've been asked a whole lot, which is, hey, is a virtual visit going to be the new normal? And like, are all visits now going to be virtual visits? And I will say that that's not our intention. First of all, the volunteers who generously give up their time to go on the visits, a big part of what they get out of it, because it takes it takes a lot of work to do a really good job reviewing the school's documents, getting ready for the visit, doing pre-visit conversations. It takes a whole lot of work for that. So the volunteers, we do this because we're a profession. We want to contribute and give back, but also they learn a lot. And that's also where you form relationships in those, in those sorts of dinners and socials and things like that, those conversations, just that face-to-face. We're doing the virtual because we want you to be able to move forward. But I don't think there's any intention for this to be the new normal. So that answer is no, and I don't think our volunteers want that either.
In terms of a visit that may be spread over a longer period due to the virtual nature, someone has asked whose responsibility. Well, someone has asked, should they be looking at a hybrid visit? Not necessarily. I believe you're a CIR school. You can plan for virtual, but you may run into a situation where the team is glad to come, or some members, so you can explore that with them. Otherwise, the plan should be virtual. What about if it extends over a longer period of time, which we say it very well could? We'd ask you to work directly with your team on the schedule, and that would include extending the visit by a day or two. Someone's asked about a CIR2, that's a continuous improvement review 2. That is when the team finds issues that lead to them not being able to recommend extension of accreditation, so the school's given a year to address. Like another comment about the virtual visit. schedule. We can take a look at that because there seems to be a lot of comments on that. I think we've got time for about one other question, and then we're going to have to wrap up. Could the chair pre-visit be on site if the actual visit would be virtual? Stephanie, do you want to take that to conclude?
Sure, if that were possible, that actually would be great. So if the chair could go on site and do the pre-visit on site, and then the visit itself occurs virtually, no problem with that.
All right, well, unfortunately we are out of time, but we do have the ability, and we will be saving this chat, and we will follow up with you personally following the webinar. So Stephanie, do you have any concluding remarks?
Sure. Well, of course, I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to make sure that you know we are partners here with you. We are here to help you and support you. So all you have to do is ask. If we didn't get to your questions today, as Suzanne said, we're going to go through them and make sure that there's a question you had that didn't get responded to, we will respond to that. So service is sort of our name. This is what we do. And we want to make sure that you're comfortable with what's happening next year, that you know what to do. Any questions, you may have many more questions. Your staff liaison is a great resource. Every school has a staff liaison. Suzanne has the link here where you can contact your staff liaison. You can also contact me or Suzanne directly. If you write to me, you will get a response from me. Same for Suzanne as well. So we want everyone to have a good experience with this. And of course, please be safe, please be healthy. We are thinking about you. You are not far from our thoughts always. As you deal with these issues in your schools, know that AACSB is there to partner with you and to help you and support you. So I hope this webinar was helpful. Someone asked about a webinar for my accreditation. I'll chat with the team about that. So far, people that have used it haven't needed that support, but certainly take a look at that. But don't forget that your team is here to support you at AACSB, and together we can make a positive difference. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.